Okay, we're going to start. Now, I'm not mic'd, so I'm going to make every effort to project. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Yeah. Sort of? Okay. Let me move up a little bit. Is this better? Yeah. Okay. I'm Alice Echols. I'm the fourth holder of the Barbara Streisand Chair in Contemporary Gender Culture. Or is it actually studies? I'm sorry. And this is the fifth and the final lecture of this year's Streisand Professor Lecture Series. Now, I want to mention a few of the highlights of this series because there have been highlights. We had Stephanie Coombs, who shared with us a dizzying amount, actually, of research about American marriage and families. Perhaps the most startling fact that she mentioned is that better educated women still face obstacles in the workplace, but they are more likely to get help from their husbands than those women with less marital bargaining power. Now, I don't know. It seems to me that, Paula, you may have some other information, but that was one of the pieces of information put forward by Professor Coombs. Professor Alana Gershon, who has studied breaking up over new social media, found that the rules around text breakups have yet to be determined. It's sort of a brand new world out there. We don't quite know how it works. But she also noted that today's undergraduates, you guys, certainly focus much more on the how rather than the why or the who of breaking up. Now, before I give the podium over to our speaker today, Professor Paula England, I want to thank Barbara Streisand, whose commitment to gender studies, and particularly to the study of intimacy and sexuality between women and men, has made this series and my named chair possible. Her generosity and her commitment to scholarly exchange on this very important subject really distinguishes her from virtually everyone that I can think of in Hollywood. Additionally, I want to give a shout out again to one very special person in our audience today. That is Rupa Balasubramanian of the Streisand Foundation. It's really been a pleasure getting to know Rupa. I also want to thank Howard Gilman, Dean of Dornside College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, for generously funding this series. And I want to thank Jeannie Weiss and Rebecca Das, our wonderful staff in Gender Studies and the Center for Feminist Research. I mean, this really, people could not happen without them. So just know that. Very, very important people, all of them, to this project. Today's speaker, Paula England, is a professor of sociology at New York University. She is among the country's most significant, most distinguished sociologists of gender, having won numerous fellowships, numerous honors, written many, many articles, and several books. I mean, if I really went through your CV and detailed it all, we would be here.
They would fall asleep.
Yes, and you absolutely would fall asleep.
It is really frightening.
She's recently turned her attention to whether the gender revolution in this country is stalled. It's a very interesting topic. Her work is nuanced, it's demanding, and very important. So please welcome her.
It's wonderful to be here. And I want to start out by thanking Barbara Streisand for supporting gender studies, which is wonderful. Gender studies has been near to my heart my whole career. And also thank Alice Echols for inviting me. Oops, I just lost my mic here. Hold on a second. I'm going to get comfortable here. So my topic, as you can see, is how love and sex have changed in heterosexual America. And there's really an alternative title I could have given this: Sex, Love, Commitment, Work, and Babies. And what I'm particularly going to be talking about is how these things, these nouns up there, have been combined differently and how that's changed in the last 50 years. I want to also talk about how the way these things are combined and the changes have varied by social class, advantage or disadvantage. And then I want to give a kind of scorecard. Have changes been good or bad or indifferent for gender equality? So as you can see, I've got lots of moving parts here. So if you'll permit me, I'm going to give you a really kind of quick sketch of some of the changes I want to talk about, and I'm going to kind of periodize them. Don't get too literal about these exact dates. I sort of shudder when there's historians in the room that take this kind of thing seriously. This is all the dates are very proximate. So because I set my task as just looking at 50, I guess we go back to the 50s, it's really 60 years ago, but that amount of time, not a bigger span. Oops. So in this period, sex and childbearing are supposed to be within marriage. They're not always, but there's a very strong norm about that. Premarital conceptions, that is when women got pregnant before marriage, often led to what's colloquially called shotgun marriages, the couple getting married before the birth to try to sort of cover up the fact that the conception was premarital and to deal with what are we going to do with this child. Marriage and childbearing typically started early, oftentimes in the late teens or the early 20s. So then we get the sexual revolution. And I put the R in parentheses because I've come to believe this is really much more of a slow evolution. But if you think of like the 70s and 80s approximately, sex before marriage becomes much more common. Typical age at first intercourse falls in the United States to a lower age. But most sex that people are having, even though much more of it is outside of marriage, is still in relationships. Relationships have less duration and commitment than marriages, but they have some longevity, some commitment and exclusivity. Many cohabit, live together before marriage. That trend starts increasing in this period. Age at marriage goes up. That's partly because people can have sex before marriage. They can live together, and for other reasons. The birth control pill and legal abortion make it possible to separate sex from babies, from having babies. Now, that may seem like not a big deal to people in this room, but it was a very big deal when people hadn't been able to have a reliable way to separate these two, or it had to use much faultier methods. Women's education and employment levels are going up during this period. I mean, they had been going up starting earlier. So all of these things are sort of happening together. I'm not going to get precise about, exactly what's causing what. Now, even though we have birth control that can separate sex and babies, non-marital births are going up simultaneously in this period. And actually, that's something that's also a long-term evolution. The proportion of women having a birth before marriage has, in some research I've been doing recently, been going up for both whites and blacks since cohorts born in the mid-20s, at least. I haven't looked back farther than that. So then we get to what I'll call the current scene, let's say the 90s forward. I know the 90s sound like ancient history to the undergraduates in the room, but I'm lumping that all together as relatively current. Premarital sex is relatively ubiquitous. Now, there's some heterogeneity here. There are subsets of people, usually those who are very religious. It's not so much which denomination, but religiosity, and who interpret their religion to prohibit premarital sex. Some of them end up doing it anyhow, but it's not like 100% of people are having it. But in the rest of the population, it's pretty ubiquitous and pretty uncontroversial. Then we start seeing, and I'm not saying this just started in the 90s, this has been sort of creeping forward as well, an increase in what I'll call non-relational sex, more casual sex, sex that's not within a relationship. And I think it's come to be somewhat ambivalently accepted. That is, the whole rise of the hookup culture is to some extent an acceptance of this. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of ambivalence about it, a lot of heterogeneity in people's attitudes, even among youth, about it. And there's a double standard, and what I mean by that is that the form the double standard takes today, I think, is that women are more harshly judged for engaging in casual sex than men are. Marriage has not gone away, and in fact, it's almost universally revered. That is, if you ask people in America in almost all social classes and races, men and women, do they want to get married sometime? 95% of them, something will say yes. There's a lot of reverence about marriage. However, people are marrying later and later for a number of reasons, and different reasons in different social classes, I think. There's a cultural change going on about marriage, and one part of it is that there's a higher economic bar to marriage. Now, you might say, well, that's a little weird. Why am I calling it a cultural change if it's economic? And here's what I mean by this. I'm not saying that the cost of the absolute prerequisites of marriage, like can we afford to move out of our parents' house and get an apartment, that's what's changed and led marriage to be later. What I'm saying is that people's ideas about what you have to have economically before you get married have kind of gone up as marriage has come to be seen as more optional. So at the same time, another and related cultural change, I think, is that there's a higher relational bar to marriage. That is, how good do people think this relationship has to be before they think it's appropriate for them to marry this person? And of course, people have always thought, I don't know about always, but certainly in the period I'm talking about, that marriage, you're supposed to love your partner, it's supposed to be a good relationship, you get along. But if you go back to the 50s or 60s, first of all, some people are getting married because they got pregnant, right? But also, you kind of had to be married to be a social adult. It's kind of like you're a kid until you get married. Well, that's pretty much over with. I think people think they're a social adult whether or not they're married at certain points. And, but again, so it becomes more optional, but people think that the person you marry should be a scintillating sexual partner and an interesting conversationalist and your best friend and your soulmate and someone you can do finances well with and a good co-parent. It's a pretty daunting, set of requirements. And then we keep having this increase in non-marital births and an increase in what demographers sometimes call multiple partner fertility, that is, having a child with two or more people, because the births in these unstable relationships often are quite early. Sometimes the couple tries to pull together, then they break up, and so somebody goes on and does it again with someone else. So as I talk about in more detail now these changes, I want to kind of divide things into how it's looked for the advantaged, the more advantaged, and the more disadvantaged in our society. And I'm thinking here both about class and race, but I'm going to emphasize in my comments and the data I give you about social class. But of course, social class and race sometimes go together and they sometimes don't. So I want to talk just in broad brush strokes about how these changes have played out differently for differently advantaged groups. So a really fundamental thing I want to emphasize is that among those who are relatively privileged, sex got separated from babies in the 60s. I mean, of course, people do also have babies later by the usual method of having sex usually, but there's usually a long period between when people become sexually active and when they decide to have a baby, during which the two things are relatively separated. And this is much more true for the relatively advantaged than for those that are disadvantaged. And the proximate cause of this is consistent contraception, backed up by Plan B or abortion. But why do we have this kind of class gradient on use of contraception consistently? Well, it's a deep question. I could talk for 2 hours about it. I won't. But here's a short version of some of the factors. First of all, women going to college, I'm going to put that in the advantaged group, are usually planning careers. They don't want them derailed by an early birth. College health centers are typically dispensing contraception, so it's relatively convenient to get, although I think many of these women would be contracepting pretty assiduously even without college health centers. I also think that as to why they're just so consistent about it, that middle-class socialization, as discussed, for example, by Annette Leroux, fosters first a kind of belief in your own efficacy, you can change things in the world, and also practice at self-regulation, things like homework, etc., and, you know, taking your pill consistently is just kind of like another form of homework, right? It's onerous, but it has its payoffs. So I think that those aspects of middle-class socialization help create consistency in contraceptive use in the middle and upper middle class. So given that I've said that sex is pretty separated from babies and there's this long period of sexual activity before people get married and think about having children, and that's the usual sequence in the upper middle class, then let's talk about that period of sexual activity, and let's talk about how it plays out in college. Now, today's sex in college takes place primarily in two different contexts, sometimes in relationships and sometimes in what students call hookups. So to study this, I collected data from an online survey of undergrads where I had 20 colleges and universities. It was collected in recent years. And I've also collected some qualitative data on this from in-depth interviews. I'm going to draw on that. So for the old people who don't know, what's a hookup? When kids use this term, what they mean is something like the following. Two people run into each other at a party or hanging out in a dorm. It's not a prearranged date, otherwise they'd call it a date, not a hookup, right? It often involves drinking. Something sexual happens, not necessarily intercourse. And hooking up with someone neither implies nor precludes a possible interest in a relationship. So tell me, undergraduates in the room, did I get that approximately right? All right. I'm getting 2 thumbs up. I'm going to argue with me about it later. I'm old, but I've been talking to my undergraduates. So what actually happens on these hookups? So in this survey, one thing I did is I asked people, how many times have you hooked up in college? Unless they said 0, I said, I'm going to ask a bunch of questions about your most recent hookup. And one of the questions was, there was just this big checklist. Here's a bunch of sexual behaviors, check all that occurred. And so I've created, if you'll forgive the term, a little bit of a base system here. So I've classified people's hookups by the farthest thing to the right that they did. So in other words, if you answered this survey and you said, well, we made out, and his hand touched my genitals, and we had oral sex, and you had intercourse, I'm going to put you over there at intercourse. If you made out and had oral sex, I'm going to put you at oral sex. All right, so you get it? I'm putting you at the, as far as you went, so to speak. So for all the hookups in the data set, about 40% of them involve intercourse. So we need to get clear that, you know, all hookups aren't intercourse, as of course the young people in the room know. In fact, 35% of them, there's nothing more going on than making out and non-genital touching. So this is a very heterogeneous term. It's a term that's so vague, very usefully vague in some ways, I think. And also we have this media idea that the modal hookup is oral sex. But actually, oral sex without intercourse is only 12% of hookups, although it certainly exists. And I think there has been a big cultural change in kind of the meaning of the casualness of oral sex relative to intercourse, and it's seen as more casual relative to intercourse now than it was, say, in my generation. It's still not the predominant hookup thing. In terms of how well people knew their hookup partner, they usually knew them somewhat or moderately well. They're not typically with strangers, although about 13% are. Now, if I just use in my data, because I have a very big sample, people that are seniors, so I can get what have they done their whole 4 years with some questions, we see that by their senior year, about 3/4 have hooked up at least once. The average is about 6 times. Now that's averaging in the people with zeros. So one thing to take home from this is if you had the impression from reading the media that, you know, people are hooking up every weekend, well, some probably are, but check that out. That average of 6, you know, that's like less than 1 per semester, right? Now, of course, one thing that slows down hookups is that at some point people often get in relationships. Slows you right down. Now, the average number of dates people have been on, so there's been a lot of talk about, is the date dead? Well, I think it's relatively dead compared to how many dates people went on when I was in college. But, you know, it's less than hookups in terms of an average. And to me, it looks like a low number, but it's not like people never date anymore. I think the meaning of dates has changed, and that dates actually mean more than they used to. They are now sometimes a way that particularly guys signal an interest. Well, sometimes people have hooked up, then there's a date. It's a way a guy kind of signals, I'm interested in more than just physical stuff. As one student, I had a great quote one time, one student said, if they want to get together with you when they're not drunk, it really means something. By their senior years, 70% have been in a relationship of at least 6 months. So the hookup scene is by no means driving out relationships. Now, is this less than would have been true 40 years ago? I don't know, because I don't think anybody has any good data on that. 80% of seniors have had intercourse. By the way, since my whole talk is about heterosexual scene, I'm limiting all these statistics to heterosexual undergraduates. So I'm talking about, you know, vaginal penile intercourse. Now, that means 20% are still virgins. At least that's what they're telling me on the survey. So, you know, again, we have heterogeneity. 50%, just dead, right about at half, have had intercourse outside an exclusive relationship. So on the one hand, I'm saying there's a trend towards a greater acceptance of this non-relational sex. On the other hand, half the people by their senior year have never done it. And over 90% aspire to marry. When asked, what age do you think you'll marry at, they give ages like, you know, 27, 28, 29. And so an interesting aspect of that is if that becomes the norm of the age at which college graduates are going to marry, fewer people are going to be marrying their college sweetheart than previously because it's so many years past. Now, in fact, there are a lot of people that get married at, you know, 24, 25, and some of them do stay in touch with their college partners. But I think that there's going to be less and less of that as marriage gets later. So how is the college hookup scene and relationship scene gendered? So one way it is men have more orgasms, bluntly put. What I'm giving you in this chart is the proportion of men and women. The first 3 pairs of bars are hookups, and I've divided the hookups into not your first time ever, but how many times had you previously hooked up with this partner. So first hookup means you had never previously hooked up with this partner. You'd hooked up with them 2 or 3 times before, 4 or more times before. Okay, so these are all hookups. And then this is, if you've been in a relationship, I asked you to remember back to the last time you did something beyond kissing with this partner. I'm calling that a sexual event. And so one thing you can see here is in every context, women orgasm less than men. You can also see that for both women or men, practice with a hookup partner makes things better. That's one interpretation. And orgasm is more common in relationships for both men and women. The third thing I want you to notice is that this gender gap, like here this is like 3 times as high as that, this gender gap is lessened as you go up here, and it's particularly less in relationships. So the gender gap in orgasm is less in relationships. Now, part of why both men and women are having orgasm more as we go across these categories is that they're doing more sexual stuff in relationships, and they're doing more sexual stuff if they've hooked up with a person 3 times than the first time. But the other part of it, I believe, from qualitative data, is that men don't seem to care that much about the pleasure of their female hookup partners. But they do seem to care very much about the pleasure of their relationship partners. Now, you might say, well, that's not just men. Anybody's going to care more if it's a relationship than if it's casual. Yes, maybe so, but when we look at women's reports, women report working pretty hard to worry about the pleasure of both their relationship partners and their hookup partners. So, you know, whether you want to call that unconditional altruism or patriarchal false consciousness oppression, you know, pick your words. But that seems to be what's going on. So the differential in men's attention to these matters is part of what's making the relationship sex more comparable for men and women. Now, the other way things are gendered in college is that the idea, when they do go out on dates, it's mostly men asking women on dates, not women asking men. And things become a relationship, or how you know you're in a relationship is often via this talk. Sometimes kids call it the define the relationship talk, or the talk. And I asked a question about how did it become clear this person was your boyfriend or girlfriend. And one answer is he initiated a define the relationship talk, she did, and some other things. Anyhow, when you see that when it was one of these talks, it's much more often the man initiating it. Now, I find when I do focus groups, all the kids are convinced that women are the ones initiating all these talks. But when I actually ask a big sample of people about how it actually went down in their actual relationships, this is what I get. Now, another way that we often think things are gendered is that we think, let's put it in the most exaggerated sense, men only care about casual sex and all women want relationships. Now, there's a little bit of truth to that as a matter of degree, but that's wildly exaggerated. So to get at that here, I'm showing you the answer to a question where you were asked about your most recent hookup. Before the hookup, how interested were you in possibly having a relationship with this person? After the hookup, how interested were you? So it's what percent said yes. And we do see that both before and after, women say yes more than men by about 9 percentage points. So there is a gender difference in at least professed interest in relationships, but it's not like, you know, no guys are interested and all women are. In fact, it's the minority of women who say they were interested with this relationship partner. The other way things are gendered is that the double standard is there. So people will talk about women who hook up with too many people as sluts, or women who go too far on hookups. Men can, of course, be seen as a man whore, but they're also likely to get high fives, especially from other men, for this behavior. Some men will say that if women give it up too easily, she's seen as less relationship or date material. Since they don't seem to see themselves as less relationship material, that seems to me to be a double standard. So I think the double standard, this was one of the big surprises to me, is really alive and well, and that's another way things are gendered. Okay, so enough for college students. What's going on in these matters among the less advantaged population? So a big difference I want to focus on is that sex is leading to babies more among the less advantaged. And the proximate cause is more inconsistent contraception. You know, it's not the case that folks have never heard of contraception, or it's actually not the case that, you know, they can't afford the birth control pill. At the moment, Planned Parenthood is there in low-income communities. It may not be in 6 months if Congress has their way, but and offering things with sliding scale. So why is there this more inconsistent contraception among the less advantaged than among the advantaged? Again, this is a deep question. We could go on forever, but I think some of the issues are that women's future job prospects are pretty bad. Say women that have dropped out of high school, or they don't see that they'll be able to ever complete college anyhow. And so while they can't really afford a child, but it's not like there's this wonderful trajectory that's going to get interrupted if they have a child. Abortion is expensive. There's no public funding, so that's sometimes a factor. They may be against abortion actually in greater numbers than the more privileged, I think, as well. Contraception is typically available at low cost or no cost, but it's often a hassle to get if you're using the low cost ways. And it's a hassle to use for everybody, but that hassle seems to be more difficult for low-income people. Also, there's a lot of side effects reported by young women, especially about the pill. And for some reason, they tend to be reported more by lower-income women. And I don't know if it's because they're in worse health or they're incorrectly attributing things to the pill that are really caused by something else, but a lot of women are stopping using the pill because of that. Growing up in very rough conditions may develop efficacy and self-regulation that I talked about earlier for the middle class less well. So then that may be less helpful to getting a regime of consistent contraception going. So I think these are some of the reasons why contraception and abortion are inconsistently used among the less privileged. Let me just give you some quick slides that compare people, and to try to get to compare by your social class background, I'm classifying people. I'm using the, those of you who may know this data set, the Ad Health data set. It's a survey of American youth and young adults, and I'm classifying them by their mother's educational level. So I'm using mothers rather than fathers because a lot of people are separated from their fathers, and then you don't have data on him. So you can see here that those whose mothers have more education from the higher SES backgrounds are more likely to say that in the last 12 months they used contraception consistently. This is limiting the analysis to people that are sexually active. Then those with higher SES background are less likely to have been pregnant. Those two things are obviously related. And if they got pregnant, those from higher SES backgrounds are more likely to have aborted. So there's kind of a double whammy, less conceptions and a higher proportion of the conceptions aborted. So actually one interesting point here is that low income and minority women and low education women actually have probably a larger number of abortions per capita than more privileged women. But that's because they have more unplanned conceptions. Conditional on a conception, they tend to abort less. And so the net result is here's the difference, these huge differences by SES background in do you actually have a baby by age 21, ages at which most people think these days it's a little early to have a baby. Of course, 50 years ago, most people were getting married and having a baby by then. Now, some people might say, based on what I've just shown you, well, maybe the poor just want kids more. So this is a really interesting graph, I think. It's boring in one sense, but fascinating in another, which is when you ask, this is from the NLSY, if you know that data set, when you ask women, how many children do you ever want to have? And the women were 14 to 21 when they were asked, okay? And then I've classified them by their race, whites, blacks, and Hispanics. Apologies to the other racial groups, I didn't have enough to do it, and by the amount of education they ultimately got. I went forward in the panel data set and found that out. The point is, all groups at the median want 2. And if you even just look at what percent want something other than 0, it's not the case that the less advantaged women want more than 0. So how many kids you want, or do you want kids, has nothing to do with this stuff. Now, there may be differences in how badly you don't want one right now, these kind of opportunity cost things that I was talking about. But the other result of these patterns are that here I'm classifying women by their own education, but you get pretty much the same thing if you classify them by their mothers, that the more advantaged have a lower proportion of all the births they have. This goes forward in a data set till they're 45. A lower proportion are unplanned or unintended. And this is based on asking women after the birth, at the time you got pregnant, were you trying to get pregnant, or had you not wanted to get pregnant then? And if you had not wanted to get pregnant right then, we're calling it unplanned. So I've given you some of the patterns among the less advantaged. What about how those patterns are gendered? I think a really big thing here is how the costs and benefits of child rearing get allocated. I mean, the costs of having children and the benefits of having children. And this is a big deal because, as I've said, people are having children earlier. So that's a big part of what's going on in the early years. So most of these early unintended births are outside of marriage. Most non-marital births today, it's not like the guy was long gone 9 months ago. There is a couple there. It may have been casual when the conception occurred, but they often pull together, try to start having a relationship so they can stay together with the child. But most of them break up within a few years. A high proportion do. The breakups, just like middle-class divorces, are usually initiated by the women who kick the men out. So at least for a while, there she is with these kids alone, because the kids usually stay with the woman. Now, child support is enforced better than ever, but many of these poor fathers have very unstable employment, very low wages, intermittent incarceration, so moms end up often getting little from child support, these poor moms. Single moms these days get little from the state. There's not much in the way of welfare. There is EITC if you have a job, but much less from the state than you would get in other countries. So what ends up happening is that women do most of the physical care of kids, but they also do most of the breadwinning for kids. They are helped sometimes with new partners that they have, new male partners who become like stepdads. And looking at the men's side of things, men suffer from disconnection with their kids and often complain bitterly about that after the couples break up. But what about the gendering of the sex and love part? I'm talking all about the kids part. My best guess, but I don't think we have good data on this, is that the kind of males are supposed to initiate things and the double standard is probably similar, not any better in the less advantaged populations than I described it in the middle class. But I sort of think that from reading various ethnographies and stuff, but I don't have really clear data on that. What we do have good qualitative work on is that it seems like a kind of gender mistrust is much more profound. I mean, we joke about the war between the sexes in all social circles, but it seems more profound at the bottom. Men complain that if they don't earn much, women are likely to break up with them, throw them out, and then won't let them see their children, especially if she re-partners with a new guy. And, they don't like this and feel that, understandably, they're not entirely in control of the fact that they can't get good jobs. women complain about sexual infidelity, violence, illegal activity, and, you know, argue they had good reason for throwing the guy out, and good reason for not letting him see the kids. So these gender conflicts are often quite profound. So if we want to summarize the trends kind of delineating them by social advantage, I think there's a lot of sex without commitment, non-relational sex, certainly sex outside of marriage in all social classes. And I actually think the sexual behavior isn't what differentiates advantage very much these days. The less advantaged do have a slightly earlier age at first intercourse, but that's actually not what's driving most of the difference in the pregnancy rates. So I think that's not the big difference. There is a big difference in the consistency with which birth control is used, as I mentioned. So then in the middle class, we have delayed marriage and delayed first birth. Both have gotten much later than, you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Among the poor, and this is kind of creeping up the class structure, there's been little delay in first birth. Women are actually having their first birth about the same age they always were, you know, 19-ish or something like that. But there's still a large delay in marriage in the case of the disadvantaged because of this kind of new high economic bar which they can't meet, and a lot of other factors. In the middle class, women are getting a college education. There has been an increase in college attendance for the less advantaged, but most don't finish a four-year degree. In the middle class, women are developing careers while they're in college, and there's been very, very large increases in women's employment after childbearing. In contrast, among the poor, there has been increase in women's employment, but less so than for college-educated women. And I think one thing that many sociologists have wrong in their head is they think that, you know, working class and poor women are more likely to be employed than upper middle class women because after all the latter have richer husbands. But the data show otherwise, that, and in fact this is true all the way back to 1950. It may be before then, but I know it's true back there. So one of my colleagues once said if it happened before 1950, Paula doesn't know about it. That more educated women have had higher employment rates. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that's because of all these sexual changes necessarily, but the consistent use of birth control in the face of the sexual revolution, I think, certainly helped. So what about I promised I was going to say something about have these changes been good or bad for gender equality. So I want to kind of give my quick scorecard on that. First, there's a couple of gendered things that just didn't budge at all. So, you know, the business that men are seen to be the ones initiating dates and relationships, it's surprising to me that in an era where college women think that they're entitled and interested in being CEOs and doctors and lawyers, that they would never think of asking a man out on a date, and that people in all social classes are still assuming men are going to propose marriage. So the gendering of that didn't change much. And I think that the sexual double standard hasn't really changed much either. Now, the consequences for a woman if she has sex outside of marriage or if she gets pregnant are much less severe now than before, but I'm not sure the doubleness of it is. So what's really changed is how casual a context you can have sex in. You know, so first the line is marriage. If you have sex outside of marriage, you're a fallen woman/man. Then, okay, that changes and people say, well, sex should be in relationships. Then some people think, well, it's all right to have sex in a hookup. So that line kind of keeps moving, but wherever that line is, it seems to me that women are judged more harshly if they cross it. And it's not obvious to me that that's changed at all. So on these two things, the changes didn't make that gender inequality worse or better. I don't think it just sort of stood there like the Rocky Mountains. Not to say I don't think it could change, but Now, what about this increased casualness of sex? There's been a lot of debate about, is this good for women, or is this just like enhanced exploitation of women? Well, usually I hate nuance, actually, but I'm going to give you a nuanced answer here. On the one hand, the college evidence shows that the sex is clearly better for women in relationships, and the gender gap in, say, orgasm is less in relationship. And that it's not a huge difference, but that women want relationships slightly more than men. So both of those two things suggest that a move towards more casualness is bad for women, and therefore bad for gender equality. But on the other hand, casual sex would be better for women if the double standard were reduced. At least if you believe that part of what's making casual sex bad for women is that men have a certain amount of disrespect for their casual partners because they themselves have imbibed the double standard. So if you got rid of that idea in the heads of men, they might care more about their partner's pleasure in the casual context. Women in the casual context might feel more entitled to pleasure. So in other words, we could say the culprit of the gender inequality in pleasure is casualness seems to make it worse, and that seems empirically true in the current context, but that may only be true because we have the double standard. So if we change the double standard, which hasn't seemed to change much, that might help as well. And then just remind you my points about the sexual revolution impacted gender inequality differently by class. So whether sex is separated from unplanned babies via consistent contraception and abortion affects whether childbearing is delayed, allowing women to develop careers, which is very important for gender equality. And it affects whether early childbearing, unplanned childbearing in unstable relationships leads women to bear more of the costs of reproduction, a form of gender inequality, and leads men to be more separated from children, another form of gender inequality. So that is what I have to present to you. I'm open for questions and comments. Thanks for your attention. Yes?
When you're looking at the gender orgasm gap between men and women comparing across the sex relationships, are you controlling for alcohol consumption?
She asked, am I controlling for alcohol consumption? No. And actually, it is true that people have tended to consume more alcohol in hookups than in relationship sex. And I've run some regressions predicting orgasm. And how many drinks you had has a slight negative effect, net of other things, on do you have an orgasm. So that would explain a little bit, but it's actually a pretty tiny factor. Are there questions? Open to criticisms, comments. Sharon.
I have two, but I'll do my orgasm gap one.
Okay.
Since we're on the orgasm.
Since we're on the topic. Not that we're sex
to me,
crazy or
right,
anything.
the most stunning thing in terms of the continuation. Yeah. What I would see actually, even in my own experience as a person who went to college in the 70s, I'm pretty sure that by the second hookup, that you got to say, excuse me, my orgasm, but all this, because we don't have data on what's going on in the 70s. But relative to that question of, was this good for women or bad for women, and if I heard you right, you seem to be suggesting that if men got rid of the double standard relative to imagining all women who have sex as sluts, then other problems, right? Then the good news about casual sex is that we get to have more of it, and hence good for women as well as men, right?
Yeah.
And the question that I had is, why peg that to the double standard? I mean, I say, what's so stunning is the orgasm gap, which says that one partner is degraded in the sexual relationship. That's what it spells to me. It says that it's actually the slut definition comes from imagining still half the world, that is to say women, as a lesser sex. So that those two things, to imagine that the orgasm gap is actually caused by the slutness, well, actually the cause is a much larger culture, right?
So you're saying it's a more generic deprecation of women, and women don't count.
Right. Women's second-class status is equally causing both things.
Right. So here's my response to that. When I used to give my undergraduate lecture on orgasm, and 10, 15 years ago, and I would be talking about orgasm in any context, right? I'd never heard of a hookup at the time. In marriage, whatever, it doesn't matter. Yeah, I would sort of argue something not quite as extreme as that, but that, well, it must tell us something about the deprecation of women that, or the dependence of women, or something that practices that don't seem to be as good for women keep persisting as a script. What's made me rethink that is seeing how different that gap is between hookups and relationships. And also reading the qualitative data, that is, the gap isn't very big in relationships. It's there, but it's tiny relative to in the casual context. And also reading the qualitative data on what both men and women say about the extent to which men very much care about the sexual pleasure of their female partners in relationships. Now, I don't want to say things are perfect and there's no gender inequality in relationships, but I would challenge you to read the transcripts I've read and look at the difference in the gaps and not see that it would be hard to argue that men are systematically not caring about any women's pleasure in any context. It seems very differentiated by context. Yes, back there.
I have a question about the graph that you showed looking at race and class and the number of children that people wanted.
Yeah.
So just a straight line across, everyone wanted two.
Yeah, and of course it's not every single person, it's the two's a median, but every group at the median wants two. Yeah.
Exactly, right. Okay. So I was just wondering if you have any data on which groups actually came the closest to achieving that. And the reason I'm asking specifically is because of the later ages for marriage and children for college
Right.
kids. I was wondering if they're actually waiting too long and actually ever achieving this.
That's a very good question. She's asking who's, everybody wants two, who's getting closer to it? And in fact, when you go out and look at the data all the way out, take people out to 45, few people have kids after that, but not very many, you see, among women, you see that on average, the lower education women have ended up having more than the two they want. Not much, but they're closer to an average of 3. And the college grads have ended up on average having less than they wanted, somewhere between 1 and 2. And it's an interesting question what happens there, and I think you're right. I mean, sometimes people wait so long to marry, to develop their career and stuff, by the time they start, they feel like they biologically can't have more than one. Sometimes I think they become very careerist. They have one. They think, oh, of course I'm going to have a second one. And then they realize, like, oh, my God, this is, so much work. Or they get disappointed in how much their partners share with them in child rearing, and jobs are inflexible, et cetera, all the stuff we study in the work family. And so sometimes they're making a decision to stick with one. So it is interesting that both groups of women, and presumably this would be true if we looked at men too, but I've tagged it to the women, and end up with kind of a different number than they wanted, but in different directions. Yeah, actually some of the research that I did related to this was with a former member of the USC Sociology Department, Kelly Music, who's not here anymore, but she and I did research on that, and she's kind of carrying on some of this research about the women that wait a long time and what happens. Yeah. Yes? Sure. And, yeah, go ahead.
On the other hand, it might actually be really difficult for women.
So she's asking, could I say more about this higher relational bar to marriage? And you said the standards that women have. Now, actually, I think all the data suggests these standards are held by men and women. So it's kind of more of a generational change in what people think marriage means. And I think it's partly because marriage becomes more optional, so therefore it has to mean more, or else what's the point, right? So, you know, if you go back to the 50s, I mean, you're not supposed to have sex if you're not married. You're certainly going to be in big trouble if you have a baby. If you're a woman, you probably can't support the baby, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You're not really a social adult. So there's all these reasons to get married early. And of course, you're trying to find a compatible partner too. But once you can have sex outside of marriage, you can live with someone for 10 years, you know, you can have a kid if you want to. So it's amazing how much people still want to get married. But in terms of, but I think you're right that this higher bar, oh, I'm being so bad for the recording here. I keep losing my mic. That on the one hand, I think it may make people wait. Well, there is data that says when people marry later, they're less likely to get a divorce. Now, that's true up to about 26 or something. I don't think we have good data pushing it beyond that and to know if that relationship continues. Because there's a certain point at which you've sort of, if you're off with what's typical for your cohort, then all the good people are gone, right? If you just thought, I'm going to wait 10 years later than everybody else in my cohort, guess what? It's a musical chairs game, and you know, you may not be able to find a very good match. So if your whole cohort's kind of doing it lockstep with you, you know, then it may be benefiting everyone. So I think that's part of the kind of thing that's driving it. I don't know if that addresses what you were thinking. Say more if you want to. Okay. Sharon, maybe take one last question.
Yeah, advantage, disadvantage group of
Yeah.
Question. When you talk about, you know, what causes higher rates of childbearing at younger ages among less advantaged women, and then you talk a lot about contraceptive use, which all of that makes perfect sense to me. In this context, you don't bring it up again, something that seems really important to me, which is the notion of what counts as social adulthood. That what counts as social adulthood for privileged women, you know, as you suggest, say more and more, consists of things like going to college, being employed, doesn't actually have to be marriage, doesn't have to be babies, but that for less advantaged women, and this is really just from, you know, my own qualitative work, the notion of social adulthood and its connections to having children seems crucial. Even so much so that I would say that the argument that says this pregnancy was unintended, and even the arguments that say birth control has lots of side effects, are actually all connected back to the notion of as soon as I have a child, I can become an adult. Right, that is my moment of autonomy. What would you think?
Yeah, well, I've been arguing with Kathy Eden about this for a decade and a half or so, about a decade, and we actually joined forces on one project and actually wrote a paper together that we informally called Preg Plan, meaning pregnancies, the planning status of the pregnancy. And I think we both moved a little bit towards each other in the process, but it is true. I mean, when you read Promises I Can Keep, you get the impression she's saying there's just not any other sources of meaning for poor women, and they really want these kids badly. And yeah, they know it's not the ideal situation, and they wish they could be in the ideal situation. And these things aren't exactly planned, but they weren't trying very hard not to. She and I worked together on another project where we really zeroed in and wrote the interview guide together. And there are those people that it wasn't explicitly planned, but it was ambivalent. But there's also a big group where I could show her, look here in the transcript, we're asking, before you got pregnant, how did you feel about getting pregnant with him right then? And they said, oh, God, no, Then, when you found out you were pregnant, how did you feel? Oh, my God, I couldn't believe it, I cried, I screamed, so there's a lot of that, too. And I think you're right. I think it's correct that the desire not to is not as strong as in the upper middle class because there's not alternative sources of meaning, and economists talk about it as opportunity costs. It's not some wonderful thing you're going to derail. But I think there is a lot of people that they really did not want to get pregnant, and that is a really big part of the story. And these pregnancies are happening in relationships where the people haven't really, I don't really care are they married or not personally. George Bush may care, but that are really fragile, and it's not clear that this is the person you want to have a kid with. So I think there is a big issue there about the planning status.
But it would seem to me really important when you're talking about why there seems to be a closer link between sex and reproduction in those communities, to also talk about the nature of work, and that work for a lot of poor women just isn't very satisfying.
Right. Yeah. So I think you're right that it's not just how much money you can make, but it's also can you have a career that's part of your identity, and that makes a difference too. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for your attention and your questions.